Eamonn, man, thank you so much for coming on the show here today. Really excited to have you on. Could you start by just telling us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, my pleasure, Mike. Thanks so much for the invite. Uh, well, I guess I'm a strength and conditioning coach, a sports scientist, and for the last number of years, I've worked with Sport Ireland Institute, where we look after Ireland's Olympic and Paralympic athletes. And so I've been really lucky to lead a strength and conditioning department here, where we get some insight and get to work with a whole bunch of different sports. It's an awesome environment to work in, and to have oversight of that and to see how different sports operate and how different athletes achieve success and how different strength and conditioning coaches operate in those environments. I'm very lucky to have that overview. And
Yeah.
my own background, is I studied sports science. I did a PhD in kind of the area of sports biomechanics, and I worked in professional rugby for quite a while before I took that move into Olympic and Paralympic sport.
Yeah, I love it, man. And I always joke around, but I love comics. I'm kind of a nerd like that. And every great comic book hero has an origin story. So I would love to hear, what's your origin story, man? How did you get into this space, strength and conditioning, or just how did you get into working out originally?
Well, I guess in terms of working out myself, or like just being really interested in strength and power training, that probably just came from being like a young rugby player, 14, 15, just trying to find my way around the weight room and find ways that I could be a little bit more robust on the rugby pitch.
Yeah.
And then I was actually really lucky. When I was 16, I did a semester in high school in Frostburg, Maryland. And that opened my eyes up hugely. Because at that time, like, you could take strength training as like a class in high school in what would have been my junior year. And the idea of doing that would have been so completely foreign in Ireland that just not what we call secondary school or high school. So that really made me realize that this is a thing that athletes need to do, and I was super interested in that. I don't have any really exciting origin story. I just consider myself like very fortunate and very lucky. I think in terms of the opportunities I had and the times at the time that I had them, I think I probably realized, maybe in my final year of secondary school or high school, that this was a potential career path. Maybe not strength and conditioning per se, but sports science and that area of study. This would have been in the early 2000s. Well, probably 1999, actually, 2000, before I started college. And so pretty early in my college study, I knew I wanted to work in or study in the area of sports science. And the reason I say I was lucky is because I feel like I landed in that sweet spot where strength and conditioning, certainly in Ireland, was beginning to become a viable career path and something you get paid to do. But it wasn't a hugely oversaturated employment market at that point, as it is now. Like, it's so hard for people to get that first paying job and actually make ends meet in the early part of their career. And so I just feel really grateful from that point of view that I feel like I just landed right in that sweet spot where it was a thing professionally, but everybody and his aunt and uncle didn't want to do it. So I got a little bit lucky there. And I guess as I navigated a degree in sports and exercise science, I kind of left rugby, became really interested in Olympic style weightlifting. That probably opened up a few doors for me into, part-time kind of paid work with teams and sports and athletes. And at the university, I did my degree in University of Limerick. Was I got to work with some really interesting people at that time in rugby and athletics, and it was a nice kind of hotbed for sports science and research and application at that time. So that all really just helped me realize that this could be a viable career, and probably helped kind of elevate me those first couple of rungs on the ladder towards getting your foot in the door into industry and actually making it a long-term career path.
Yeah. I think one of the things that I love about your work is the fact that you have seen both sides of it. And I think, I came up, most people don't know it, but I was in a research-based environment early on. But I always came back into the weight room. And I think that's something that's unique about yourself as well, right? Is you've always tried to marry the two between you've been entrenched in the rugby space and you've done those things on the weight room and on the pitch, but you've also had that time in the research lab. And I think that gives you a really unique perspective on training as a whole.
Yeah. And again, I'm very much a practitioner now, and I'm lucky to maybe have a little bit of involvement or insight into some research projects, but 99% of my work is as a practitioner.
Yeah.
But again, I'd probably go back to just being lucky to probably work with the right people at the right time. My PhD supervisor was a guy called Dr. Drew Harrison, who, yes, was a very well published sports biomechanics researcher, but he and his wife were also, they ran an athletics track and field training group that has produced multiple Olympians over 20, 30 years, right on our doorstep where I live. And
that's cool.
Where I went to college, and I got to work with, the PhD students who were ahead of me, people like Dr. Tom Cummins, who was actually my predecessor in the role that I'm in now, where, he was conducting this applied research on rugby playing populations. It was embedded into their physical development programs. And so I think I was lucky to work in a research group there, and that was very much embedded in the application of the sport science, the strength training science into actual athletic development.
Yeah, I love it, man. Okay, so I know you've been asked this at least 1,000 times, but to clarify for my audience, because maybe they've never heard of you before and they're not familiar with your work, I think we should probably start here. What are the biggest differences between jumps and plyometrics? I know it's a simple question, but I think if we kind of lay the definition and the terminology now, it'll make everything easy.
Yeah, no, I think it's a very fair question. And I think in some degrees you can argue it doesn't matter. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, people use the language that they're used to, and what I call one thing, you don't call it the same thing. It doesn't change what the thing is.
Sure.
But like you said, I think it's sometimes important just to have a shared language, have a shared vocabulary, so that when we are talking about training and training science, we're really clear on what we're talking about. And those two terms, jumps and plyometrics, they do get used interchangeably. And again, I'm not one to say that this is right and this is wrong.
Right.
So for me, like, jumps are those big jump height focused efforts, things like vertical jumping, broad jumps for distance, exercises where you have really large range of motion or really large angular displacement at the knees, the hips. And they'll tend to be slower exercises in terms of their eccentric rate of force development. They'll tend to have longer contraction times. Your contraction time from the onset of movement to take off in a counter movement jump or a vertical jump for height might be 0.6 of a second, let's say. And they'll tend to kind of leverage, when we talk about the stretch shortening cycle, they'll tend to leverage what we might call the slow stretch shortening cycle. And on the other side of the continuum, you'll have your plyometric training, which is probably more impact driven, like there was a distinct ground impact phase.
Yep.
There'll tend to be a lot less range of motion or angular displacement of the knees and the hips. It's a stiffer, bouncier action. You'll have much higher rates of eccentric force development. You'll have much shorter contraction times, maybe 200 milliseconds as opposed to 600 milliseconds. And again, when we talk about, the stretch shortening cycle, we might call it the fast stretch shortening cycle. And so what that means, slow versus fast stretch shortening cycle, what that means is that there are probably just different underlying mechanical and neural factors at play in the execution of jumps or plyometrics. And again, why does that matter? Well, that matters because the type of strength quality development we might get from jumps or plyometrics might be quite different. So I think about jumps as being, a lot of people will talk about jump training as being like power output, let's say, training power or something like that. I prefer the term, let's call it fast maximal strength development. And so what is fast maximal strength development? It's our ability to produce force in relatively short time frames against low external loads or minimal external load. Our plyometrics, on the other hand, they will maybe more train that physical quality of reactive strength. What's that? That's our ability to create force during those fast stretch shortening cycles in really short ground contact times or contraction times with, under that condition of ground impact. So they're two quite different strength qualities. So there'll be a degree of overlap. The Venn diagram won't be completely separate. There'll be a degree of overlap, but they probably are different discrete strength qualities, with less than 50% overlap, let's say. So for me, they're two very viable training tools, but your relative need for jumps versus plyometrics is very much going to depend on the athletes that are in front of you, their needs, the demands of their sports, and you may have a far greater percentage of plyometric training for a sprinter or, an athlete that has a lot of impact in their program versus, let's say, a rower or a cyclist, which has longer times to apply force and no inherent impact in their sport.
Yeah, I love it, man. Okay, so I'm going to give you a little build up here, and then I'll ask the question. If you're not watching, I'm going to flash all of these notes that I took of Eamonn's different videos and podcasts and all these things. But I'll be honest, you're one of the few people I really enjoy following on Twitter. So I'm just going to throw that out there. You always have great stuff on Twitter, and this is a Twitter-based question. Because a while back, you mentioned that a big mistake that we're making, right, probably as an industry, is that we're using the CMJ as this catch-all test, right? And we're using the CMJ, and then we're using it, and we're looking at all 60 metrics or 80 metrics or whatever, and then trying to extrapolate all this information from one test. So I want to start there. Why is that potentially a mistake?
Okay, so I guess what I'm going to immediately do is row back a little bit on how definitive the statement is. And
sure.
If it was that definitive, it might have been, just for the sake of stimulating some debate or something. I'm not that sure about anything I say.
Or I might have just misstated a little bit.
No.
Anyway, go ahead.
It's fair. But yeah, so I guess my thought here is, first of all, I think counter movement jump test is an excellent test. And it's one of the tests that's so easy to implement. Not everybody, but almost everybody can do it. And it's got so many relatively strong correlations to so many different aspects of performance.
Yep.
And it's a test that if I was only going to do one test with 100 athletes, all from different sports, that's probably the one I would do.
Yep.
So it's not to diminish the relative value of that test. If we go back, if we go back 20 years or whenever, most of us were doing counter movement jump testing with maybe a Vertec apparatus or maybe like a switch mat, a jump mat of some kind that just gives us our flight time, and we just put it through a little equation and flight time gives us jump height. And obviously, in recent times, things like force plates have become far more ubiquitous in the industry, and they are an incredible tool to get such like a granularity of detail around performance in things like counter movement jumps. And again, I guess like what you've outlined, the temptation then can be, well, if we can measure eccentric impulse or eccentric rate of force development, or we can measure concentric impulse or contraction time, or all these different things in the counter movement jump, well, then the trap I think we can fall into a little bit is, well, I can just do the counter movement jump and assess all these different strength qualities in our athletes.
Yep.
Problem is, I guess, is that in order to assess a quality of some kind, you've got to stress it. Do you know what I mean? So, for example, if I want to assess an athlete's speed, I've got to get them to run really fast. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And if I get them to run at 80% and I time them, it doesn't really tell me anything. And so I guess a counter movement jump, it is, it falls into that jump training, jump testing paradigm. It's probably a really good indicator of slow stretch shortening of cyclability, or that quality I spoke about, fast, maximal dynamic strength. And it's a really good indicator of those things. But it doesn't particularly stress or overload let's say the rate of eccentric force development the way a depth jumper would. It doesn't really stress or overload the physical quality of reactive strength the way a drop jump might or a rebound test might. But at the same time, when you get all your export data on the force plate, you'll see one of those metrics in there. It's called the RSI modified, the reactive strength index modified. Right. It's not actually anything to do with the physical quality of reactive strength. It's just a kind of a proxy for something else. So I guess again, for me, it comes down to you've got to really stress or overload or demand the physical quality that you want to assess. And the counter movement jump demands and stresses that physical quality of fast, maximal dynamic strength or slow stretch shortening cycle performance. But that doesn't mean that it really stresses or overloads those other qualities underneath. Yep. So, if you want to stress the athlete a little bit more with eccentric impulse, for example, well, then maybe you should do a loaded counter movement jump. If you want to look at those with specific rate of force development concentrically, well, then maybe you should do a concentric only squat jump. If you really want to look at the reactive strength qualities, that ability to produce force in like 200 milliseconds under those conditions of ground impact, then maybe a reactive strength test, like a 10 to 5 rebound jump test or a drop jump is a better measure. And again, this isn't like, I think force plates are a really valuable tool, and like they can just give you such a granularity of detail, like it's amazing, really. But at the same time, they can also be quite overwhelming if you're not really sure about what you want to look at. And for example, like I use force plates in my PhD, which is like 15 years ago. You know what I mean?
Yep.
And I've had force plates in my workplace for the last 8 or 9 years. And even still, I'm kind of scratching my head. I'm wondering, like, do I look at this metric? Do I look at that one? Like, it's pretty confusing.
Yeah.
So it can be a little bit overwhelming, even if you've spent a lot of time in that space and in that domain. Whereas if you pick more specific tests, as I outlined, like squat jump for concentric reinforced development, let's say, if you pick more specific tests, I think you can look at much more simple metrics.
Yes.
So for example, if you do a depth jump, so you step off a box and you land through a range of motion similar to a vertical jump, and you explode upwards as high as you can. And if you just look at jump height and you rank all your athletes on jump height in that task, well, the ones who have bigger jump height in that task, because it's so specific and because it demands so much of eccentric impulse generation and eccentric rate of force development, those athletes are going to have the best eccentric force production capabilities. You don't necessarily need to measure it. You can, obviously you can, and you get a bigger level of detail, but you don't necessarily have to. So sometimes I think we try and almost do too much with the simple counter movement jump. And we're probably looking at maybe some elements of performance there that actually aren't stretched or strained enough to really tell us what's going on.
Yeah. Dude, that was such a good answer, because part of the reason it hit home for me was I was falling into that trap myself a little bit. Again, you can pull so much data from it. And part of it is when you're going through a testing process, there's a difference between, hey, I want to go through the full battery of tests versus, hey, I'm just going to like track readiness, right? Or I'm just checking these long-term trends. And so I'd kind of fallen into that trap a little bit. And I just thought that was such a great way to look at it is, hey, instead of using one test and looking at 60 metrics, pick some very selective targeted tests, look at a few specific targeted metrics. And I think ultimately you're going to be more successful. And two, the other thing is too, you're absolutely right. It can be very easy to get overwhelmed with all of the information, right? And I mean, you look at some of these tests now, and you can have 80, 100, 120 metrics to look at. Well, then which ones are valuable? And so I think this just makes it easier. You have more specific targeted tests, fewer metrics to look at. And I think ultimately you probably get better information overall.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And I think one of the other things as well is there's different reasons that we do testing. And one of the reasons is, to track athlete progress over time. We're trying to inform our training programs. Another one is, to have some robust objective data in times of crisis, when an athlete is injured, when an athlete figure out some kind of performance problem. And a lot of the time in that instance, you don't know what you need until you need it. So if you have a slightly more varied battery of tests, and you've got all this force plate data under the hood, which is great. But again, when in that kind of time of crisis, if it's an ankle injury, counter movement jump maybe isn't so relevant. But if you've got that 10 to 5 rebound jump test also there, that's helpful. But again, at the same time, you got to cut your cloth. You can't do everything. Like there's 100 different jump tests you could do. Never mind the methods. So at some point, you got to live in the practical world. You got to do what's practical. You got to cut your cloth for the time, the equipment, the logistics that you have in front of you. And again, if I was only going to do one test with everybody, it would probably be the counter jump test.
Sure. I love it, man. Okay. So I got one more kind of testing related question, and then I want to talk some training. In another post, you talked about not only the power of concentric impulse, which I know most people are loving to look at and nerd out on, but eccentric impulse as well. So I'd love to start there. Why is eccentric impulse or rate of force development, why does it matter? Why should we be looking at it?
And okay. So I guess I think this is the start of the training conversation, really, because so again, a lot of the time, if we go back to our old jump mats or our switch mats, and when we just looked at jump height in the counter movement jump test, a lot of them we didn't do that because we thought our athletes needed to jump height. Maybe they did, but a lot of them we still do those tests with athletes who don't need to jump height, because we know that counter movement jump test is a good proxy for how quickly you can apply the force that you've developed in the weight room into more dynamic activities. We know it's a good proxy for fiber type. You know, your fiber type, fast fiber type guys are usually going to jump higher. There's a bunch of different reasons we would do it. But ultimately, jump height is determined by takeoff velocity. So how fast is your center of mass moving when you leave the ground? That's directly determined by how much concentric impulse we produce. So you can get into that headspace of thinking, a concentric impulse is the only thing that matters. But if that was the case, we wouldn't jump higher in a counter movement jump than a concentric only squat jump, which is what we do. So if you put an athlete into a concentric only position, they've got to jump up with no preload, no counter movement. Let's say they jump 40 centimeters, or I don't know what that is for you guys, 20 inches or something.
Yeah.
Maybe 80 inches. If they're going to do that, then, you then allow them to counter movement, they'll jump 10, 15% higher, something like that. And so what's happening there is there's a couple of things that happen in the counter movement. You get this unloading phase where the athlete actually reduces their body weight, they drop, and force drops below their body weight. That gets them moving downwards. Then at some point, you got a subconscious choice. You can either crumble like a sack of potatoes on the ground. You can put your brakes on. You can generate force really quickly, eccentrically, but while you're still moving down. It's the hard bit to get your head around. You can generate that force really quickly, or you can generate a lot of force in the eccentric phase. And so if you can generate force really quickly, so you can have really high eccentric rates of force development, that's going to enhance your ability to use some of those reflexive mechanisms of the stretch shortening cycle. And if you can generate a lot of impulse in those short time periods, you're going to have more active force. So your force is already going to be really high by the time you arrive into the concentric phase. You're not starting from zero. You're starting from like 1800 newtons, and you can build off of that. And you're also going to have more active motor unit recruitment by the time it comes to moving into the concentric phase. So effectively, that ability to eccentrically load quickly, or that ability to eccentrically lower a large magnitude of force, that underpins all the concentric force output that you produce in almost all sport, unless you're in a truly concentric sport. There's not many of them. Maybe some elements of track cycling, maybe a sprinter taking his first step out of the blocks, maybe some elements of rowing, although that's arguably there is a bit of a stretch shortening cycle there.
Sure.
So I think it's really important. I know we started talking about testing, but from a training point of view, it's really important that athletes develop the ability to create or to manage force eccentrically at high rates and with big magnitudes in order to increase the amount of concentric output that they can actually produce.
Yeah. No, I love that. And I think so many people, they do get so caught up in just, what is takeoff velocity? What is jump height? And they don't understand that, hey, but if you can really slam those brakes on, if you can learn how to manage or mitigate those forces and use that, that can really be a superpower. And so that's one of the things that I'm trying to help my especially my younger athletes understand, right? It's like, hey, it's not just that number. It's like, hey, there's all these other things that we're working on that, man, if we can teach you how to store and utilize that energy, you're going to be able to jump even higher. Then the hard part becomes, then they want to just slam down. And like you said, there's moments where they look like that sack of potatoes, right? And they just want to crumble, and they, the double peak is there, or this massive braking, and they don't understand how to turn it around. But I think that's one of the things, if you can help them understand that, and then over time understand how to slam those brakes, use it, store it, and then reapply it, that's where you can really start to unlock some pretty incredible things athletically.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that makes sense to me.
So simple, but maybe not easy question. And again, I'm thinking for my young athletes here, when is somebody ready for plyos?
No, I think that's just in some cases that's a simple question. Again, maybe it comes back to how you define plyometric training.
Yep.
So at the beginning, I talked about jump training and plyometric training, and I think there's a purist point of view that could argue fairly that plyometric training is true, high intensity, very high ground impact force training.
Yes.
When it comes to that type of very high-end plyometrics, such as, let's say, drop jumps or depth jumps or very advanced bounding exercises done with maximal attentive effort. If we're talking about that, then there's probably some very careful progressions we need to make to get to that point. If we're talking about maybe sub-maximal plyometrics, where you're learning stiffness, you're learning how to control your interactions with the ground, you're learning how to manage some of those eccentric forces, and that I think is something that should be present in kind of all athletic development programs. And I mean, if you've got kids who do athletics or track and field, as you guys call it, you see them doing hurdle jumps and bounds and skipping as soon as you drop them off at the track. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's part of an overall long-term progression plan. And so I think the important thing is that, you have a long-term plan, either as a strength and conditioning coach or a sprint coach or whatever it is. You have a long-term plan where the competencies, the movement competencies and the strength qualities that you're developing layer and build on each other over time.
Yeah.
And so I probably typically think about plyometrics, let's say for simplicity's sake, in maybe 3 phases. The first phase, I think typically people talk about extensive plyometrics and intensive plyometrics. I maybe talk about like a foundation phase, and this foundation phase may not even be jumper plyometric based. But maybe it's walking, marching, skipping kind of drills. It's stuff where you're getting, as a coach, you're getting a chance to observe the athlete's kind of foot, ankle, calf ability, how they interact with the ground, how they maintain postures. From an athlete's point of view, they're learning how to create stiffness and springiness and bounciness off the ground. Over here in Ireland, you mentioned I work in rugby for years. We have a lot of field sports here. We have terrible weather. We don't have a lot of like artificial turf. So most of our sports are played on like soft, spongy, wet conditions, especially in our off seasons and pre-seasons when it's winter time. And then actually by the time we come to compete in big events, it's summertime and the surfaces are hard again. So, you end up like, for me, the athletes I've seen over the years, there's a lot of low-hanging fruit there. Where just building up an athlete's ability to stiffen or be stiff or be compliant as needed, pre-activate before they hit the ground, have good postures when they hit the ground. That's really useful. That to me is the foundation phase. And the kind of physical development that can sit alongside that pretty well is, things like your calf isometrics or your basic calf capacity work. Like I said, marching drills, postural work. Then to me, you kind of go into maybe more of a development phase. And this is where I think you can begin to maybe stretch the volume a little bit more if you want to challenge like work capacity. And this might be a little bit like the type of work that maybe like the Rudiment series from Altus has kind of popularized, or maybe a little bit more intensely than that. Maybe some of the lower limb conditioning circuits that people like Vern Gambetta or Boo Schexnayder have popularized. Or you can maybe intensify a little bit more in that space and, begin to use plyometrics where maybe the intent of effort is quite high. Maybe it's even near maximal, but the activities that you're doing are within the ability of the athlete. So what I mean by that is there's a big difference between an athlete maybe doing pogo jumps, where they jump repeatedly off short ground contact times, but they're fundamentally constrained by how high they can jump. So if I can only jump 12 to 14 inches, 30 to 40 centimeters, that's the constraint on my ground impact momentum. Whereas if I put an athlete on a 50 centimeter box or whatever that is, a 20-inch box, 22-inch box, I'm putting them potentially beyond their own capacity. And it's okay to, we're here to overload athletes, but I'm overloading some of those qualities. So that to me is the next stage, what I would call maybe intensification or realization. That's probably more like the high-end plyometrics that look great on Instagram, that are very high intensity, that most people think about when they think about true plyometric training. It might be drop jumps, it might be repeat hurdle jumps where the hurdle height is quite high and the athletes have to flex and rapidly extend as they come over the hurdle. It might be bounding for distance, which is quite a challenging impact demand because now all your body weight is having to decelerate to a degree as you move forward horizontally, but also you're taking all your body weight on one limb. So I think, again, if you're working with an athlete who's 14, it might take you 5 or 6 years to work through that progression plan. You're building up their basic strength capacities, you're building up their ability to jump and land, you're building up their ability to maximally hop or pogo. And if you're working with a more mature, established athlete, you might follow that progression plan in a single season because they have a history of work that they've already done, and it's now more about just progressing to the high-end output stuff in a safe and controlled manner while they maybe reestablish some of their existing strength qualities off the back of an off-season or an injury or whatever it may be.
Yeah, dude, so thorough. I love it. One of the things that I wrote down, because part of the reason I ask you that is we came up in a day and age where it was like, oh, you have to squat 2 times body weight, right, to do plyometrics. And that never really resonated with, I think, a lot of us. You kind of question that because it's a very blanket statement. But the other thing that I'm sure you're aware of is like sometimes the most bouncy, the most elastic people that we have, right? Probably some that are the most qualified to do those things are horrible in a weight room, right? Their levers don't support them in a way that's meaningful. They don't have a lot of time under a barbell. Right. But then you can go and have them do some of those things. And they've done them so many times, just playing pickup basketball or recreational sports. Like those are the things that they can do inherently at a high level. One of the things in one of the previous podcasts or shows that I was listening to, I just loved how you described plyometrics as like it's a very specialized form of strength. And I thought that really resonated with me because the way we define strength or force development maybe needs to shift a little bit. Because we have such a tendency and a bias to think of it as only things that happen in a weight room, whereas plyometrics can be a very specific, targeted way of applying strength, like you alluded to, just in a very time-constrained manner.
Yeah. And I have a bunch of things I could pick up on that.
Yeah, go ahead.
We'll start by saying, that's where I think, again, the shared language that we use as an industry or as collegial professionals is really important. And that's why I almost always give a nod to the work of people like Lachlan James, who's an Australian researcher who's got a recent paper that I refer to all the time because it just does a really good job of outlining what those different strength qualities actually are when we talk about lower limb strength. And then if you look at them in the context of external load or maybe total impulse produced and time available to apply the force, that's when you get this picture of these maybe 5 distinct strength qualities, your isometric, and we probably do address all of them in different ways, but maybe sometimes we call them different things or don't quite understand that they are different things. And so you have your isometric strength, which is really popular at the moment. You have your fast, heavy dynamic strength, which is it's the nuts and bolts of what we do in the weight room. It's heavy squats, it's deadlifts. You have that fast dynamic strength, which we've spoken about. It's your counter movement jumps, your jumps for distance or jumps for height, big joint ranges of motion. Longer, faster than strength work, but longer than plyometric work in terms of traction times. We have this kind of more unique quality of explosive strength, our ability to produce like really high levels of force from 0 to 100 in really short time frames against quite high external resistance. So that could be, for example, we might test that with the isometric mid-thigh pull-up, where although it's an isometric test, we could look at how much force you produce in that first 200 milliseconds to get an example of your ability to really switch on a lot of muscle fibers really quickly in a synchronized manner against this immovable force, this really high external load. But I think exercises like depth jumps, so not drop jumps, but depth jumps where we step off and we yield into a counter movement jump position. And that's probably a nice indicator of explosive strength as well. And then we have the reactive strength quality that you were talking about, which is more, let's call it your plyometric strength. So these are actually quite different strength qualities. And if you take 100 athletes and you test them in all of these 5 strength qualities, the same athlete will very, very rarely be good at all of them. Different strength profiles. And we know this intuitively. Even in sprinting, you've got your pushers and you've got your bouncers and, you've got stride length dependent athletes and you've got like high turnover athletes. So you'll see those kind of individual profiles when you take that approach. I guess going back to the 2.5 times body weight squat to do plyometrics thing, I don't want to dismiss that totally out of hand as well, because I think it is interesting to talk about. I think I could be wrong on this, but I think that narrative developed as a result probably of a lot of the, maybe the Soviet kind of training approaches, really very influential, probably for people of our age where,
For sure.
like just probably timing wise with the translation of those texts and the popularization of them, of Zatsiorsky and Verkhoshansky and these kind of things, that probably happened right around, us beginning to get interested in this stuff.
Yep.
And so there's a whole lot to learn there. Like there's a real lot to learn. But I think one of the underlying principles there is that a lot of these texts were based on systems, and systems that involve many athletes being exposed to quite robust, demanding, and very well structured training systems from a relatively young age.
Yes.
So you had athletes who were exposed to strength training young and it worked in tandem with many of the other qualities that we're talking about. Where I think what happens with us a lot, maybe less so these days, but a lot of time, you'll get landed with that 19, 20-year-old who's got exceptional physical qualities, but has never been in the weight room. So there hasn't been that same development in tandem over time. I think with those Soviet type approaches, there was probably a degree of like, well, you don't need to move on to the depth jumps until you've maximized the real simple thing of getting strong. Like,
yes.
You get that at the right age and the right time, and you teach it how to squat. It's pretty easy to get up to like a 1 days, 2 times body weight back squat, especially if they're in a sport like weightlifting. Well, sorry, bad example. Gymnastics or track, where they have light body weights anyway. If you've got, I don't know, like an offensive lineman, it's going to be really hard to get that to 2.5 times body weight squat. So I think that's maybe where that. So I don't think we dismiss the 2 times body weight squat route. I think we just accept that it was a very appropriate signpost in quite a different system to what a lot of us operate.
Dude, that's such a good point, because especially as I'm thinking about it now, I've got so many kids, especially like high school and, some of these college age kids or guys that are literally, they've got 1 year of college and they're going to go play in the NBA or they're going to play professionally. They haven't had those years of systematic development through a system, right? Sometimes they've had almost no physical training, right? They're just that highly skilled at their sport. So yeah, they have numbers and they have the anthropometric size that's necessary to play at a certain level, but they haven't had that systematic buildup. And so that's where, man, if you just had that, imagine how much better they would be. And ultimately, that's why guys like us step in and we can be successful, because we're just giving them those physical tools that they didn't get when they were 12 or 13 or 14 years old.
But I think a big thing that you're doing, and this is where, like, I don't want to be all cliched, but this is where like the art of coaching really is the important bit, is you also have to make judgment calls on how long do I actually have this athlete in front of me. Like, so
absolutely,
if you've got a 19-year-old and I don't know, I don't know exactly, but they're going to have some goal that they need to achieve in the next 1 to 3 years. And if they don't, they're kind of done. Either they don't make their college football team, or over here, they don't get a contract in professional rugby, or they don't get into a senior development squad. So at some point, it would be lovely to do this, like follow this beautiful system and do things exactly the way we should. But at some point, there has to be maybe a shared decision making around and a judgment call around, well, we don't have time for that. So what can we do in the next 1 to 3 years that's going to, or maybe the next 1 to 3 weeks, you're training somebody for a combine, I don't know.
Yeah.
And so what can we do that's going to like maximize short-term gain, long-term development, and also keep you safe and healthy? That's the real balance you got to guess.
Yeah. I call it the good enough spot.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. There's like good enough. Like if somebody comes to me and we have 3 months of an off season, I would love for them to move perfectly. Right. But I don't have 3 months to just focus on movement quality. We got maybe a month. Like, let's get you moving and feeling better. All right. Now we have to really train. And then we have 1 month to get you ready to go, be able to perform at camp. So I love that. And I think this actually works well because, we were talking about the different strength qualities and personal bias here. If I see something just echoed incessantly over social media, I'm immediately turned off by it. And so about a year ago, everybody was talking about resisted jumps, right? Everybody's got dumbbells in their hands. They're doing resisted jumps. But I'm also of the mindset, there's almost always a place for stuff, right? But personally, I just hadn't figured out where is that. And I feel like you're a great guy to ask, because I feel like there's obviously a time and a place for this, where we're adding external load to our jumps. I would just love to hear from you. Like, where would you use that as a training tool? Like, in what instance, like, this person has this deficiency, or I feel like they need this. where would you use more external loads to help somebody with their physical development?
Okay. Yeah, great question. So let's go back to our strength qualities. So we can forget about reactive strength because we're not going to react that plyometric impact, short time constraint. Forget about that. And we can forget about isometric strength because that involves no movement. So we're left with maximal strength, like the domain of the weight room. Fast maximal dynamic strength, which I said is more like what we do in vertical jumping or counter movement jumping or broad jumps. And we've got that explosive strength quality, which is our ability to produce force really quickly against big external loads. So they're probably the three strength qualities that, depending on how we set up our jumps, we might address in some way. And while I am talking about those being discrete qualities, like the world is messy and there's overlap.
Yeah, sure.
They're different enough that we can talk about them as different things, but there's going to be overlap. We all know if weak athlete, pretty strong, they'll probably add a little bit to their vertical jump. There's a high degree of dynamic correspondence, those two things. So I think the first thing is having clarity on what the demands of the sport are and what you're hoping to achieve. So let's take I don't say it's a simple sport, but I work in rowing quite a bit at the moment.
Yeah.
In some ways it's a simple sport because it's a sagittal plane, repetitive, action that involves leg extension and elbow flexion, Not to oversimplify it. And so what are we doing there? Well, we know that each rowing stroke involves, you need to create force quickly in deep flexion, the hips and the knees, and you need to be able to sustain that over a long distance to have an appropriate stroke length. And so basic strength training can be really useful. You put athletes into deep knee and hip flexion, you load them up heavy, you develop their brute strength in those patterns. But if we want to maybe work on their ability to apply that strength at faster speed, so in rowing there will be faster stroke lengths, we're going to need to do some work that's a little bit quicker. Now, there's no point applying very low levels of force fast. That's why most of us default to getting strong first. But again, for me, once you're heading into that domain of kind of diminishing returns from strength work, where it's really hard to squeeze the last few kilos out of improvement, then it makes sense to me that, you start to use loaded jumps as a way to express that strength quickly, but also as a way to express that strength through the full range of motion. So you got to remember what happens in maximal strength training. We put a heavy weight on our back. We squat down to the bottom position, or we start the trap bar from there, whatever. When we come to the top of the rep, we stop. That's all. Stop, and then we do it again. If you've stopped, you've decelerated. You might think that you're moving with a maximal intensive effort, but you've stopped, so you must have decelerated. And we know with heavy loads, even if you have really high intensive effort, the last 10, 15, maybe even 20% of the range of motion is you're actually decelerating. So you're training the athlete to stop. When, in certain sports, you want to train the athlete to accelerate through that full range of motion. So jumping is useful just to make the exercise ballistic, just to change the inherent biomechanical demands of the exercise. It's useful. Then I guess the question is, well, why don't you just jump? Forget about the load. Why don't you just jump? And it's a fair question. And I guess what you can do with loading is you can manipulate the demands of the jump. I think to start with, we do a lot of body weight jumping. So for example, let's talk about speed training for a second. Most of us don't do speed training. Let's say if you were a sprint coach or something. But most of us don't do speed training just by running really fast as you can all the time. Every single session. We do tempo running, we do acceleration work, top speed work, maybe resisted sprinting. We do speed endurance work. There's lots of different tools and methods that we use because I think inherently we understand that if you use the same tool all the time, there's a degree of monotony and stagnation that occurs. And if we think about counter movement jumping, we do that a lot. We test it. We do it in training. People have jumped all their life with their body weight. So adding load does two things. One, it changes the stimulus just enough. And I talk about loading in a second. It changes the stimulus just enough that it's, I think, a varied stimulus to what we've been doing all our life, just jumping. But also you could use it to manipulate certain parts of the action as well. So if we add load, let's say we add 20 to 30% body weight load. what we'll tend to get we'll get more eccentric impulse production. We'll get longer contraction times. We'll jump slower because it's heavy.
Yeah,
and we
sure.
won't jump as high. So you say, oh, we're not jumping as high. That's not good. What we are doing is we're training that eccentric impulse component, creating more impulse eccentrically than we would have done just with a standard bodyweight counter movement jump. At some point as you add load, but at that loading, 20-30% bodyweight, let's say, in a relatively well-trained athlete, you are still seeing, if you look at the force trace, or you look at the action, the jumping action, you're still seeing the same kind of underlying mechanics of the slow stretch shortening cycle.
Yeah.
They load, they put the brakes on, they reverse direction, they jump relatively high, they land. I think the slow stretch shortening cycle is still relatively intact.
Yep.
At some point of load, you can see this. Again, it's a linear relationship until it's not. At some point of load, and it will depend on how strong you are, but at some point of load, things break down a little bit and it becomes a different action. You probably move from that fast dynamic strength sphere more towards holistic but heavy dynamic strength.
Yeah.
And what you'll see happen there is you'll probably see athletes cut the depth of the jump a little bit. You'll see them, you'll probably see, if you look at your force trace, the force trace will become a little chunkier. It won't be as smooth. So it becomes kind of a different thing. And that's not a bad thing. So again, let's take rowing for the example. Rowing for me is, we talk about strength qualities. You don't need a lot of reactive strength. They're sitting down.
Yeah, sure.
And so again, for me, it's about developing probably more the fast dynamic strength and the maximal strength quality. So we might load those athletes pretty heavy in their jumps because it's a slow sport. They have 600, 700, 800 milliseconds to generate the impulse across the entire stroke.
Yeah.
And we want them to roll on and apply that force for a long time. So loading up the jumps and making the jumps longer might be a really good thing. And we also know that it's probably not a true or an exact slow stretch shortening cycle in the boat because gravity is not acting on you in the same way. So we're less concerned about that. But again, if we're more of a speed sport, we might really want to protect the underlying stretch shortening cycle mechanism. And we might just want to load them 20 to 40% body mass to kind of protect that, but also still provide a different stimulus or something.
Yeah.
So I think loaded jumps are really valuable, but I think where loaded jumps get really useful is when you manipulate the exercise itself to do something that you weren't able to do otherwise. And so this is where, again, I guess stuff like maybe AEL jumps, so accentuated eccentric loaded jumps, can be really useful. So that's where you hold the load, and you drop into your eccentric phase with the load, but as well as you can, you drop it in the bonding position and then you jump unload it.
Yep.
And so that can potentially be a really useful tool because it almost allows you to have a little bit of the best of both worlds.
Yeah.
Have the load on the way down, which means you're getting that increase in eccentric impulse.
Yep.
I can't prove this, but I think because athletes know they're dumping the load, they're willing to throw themselves into that eccentric phase really quickly. And so because of that, you also get the impulse, but you also get the high rate of eccentric force development.
Yeah.
And then because they do that, you get quite a lot of potential. You get high motor unit improvement. You get those reflexive stretch shortening cycle mechanisms potentially kicking in. And then because they've dumped the weight, you get all the speed of the concentric phase.
Yes.
As you might have been hoping for. And a lot of the time, it's hard to measure, but a lot of the time athletes will actually jump just as high, if not higher than their counter movement jump when you do that. So it's like getting a couple of box tick one exercise. You're getting that high rate and high impulse eccentric loading, but you're still it's different enough from counter movement jumping that we've done a lot of for it to be a unique stimulus.
Right.
And then on the other side of it, we still have the really standard high takeoff velocities that we get from counter movement jumping. So that's a really good example of how to manipulate a jump to get something relatively unique from it.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. That I just had like so many light bulbs. I'm just imagining we've all seen that person with the force trace and their braking is like this. It's like this slow incline. And I'm just thinking like for people like that to help them really try and learn how to like, hey, you got to really drop hard, understand like now you can let go of those weights and really let go. I could just see that being like such a great tool for people like that. Interesting. The other thing that you kept mentioning that I think is very important for all the coaches listening to this is no less than probably 4 or 5 times today, you've talked about movement competency. So just because we're programming jumps, plyometrics, any of those things, we're still like adhering to the fact that we want people to move well, right? And I think one thing that you mentioned, and I noticed this originally with athletes, there's definitely a point when you're doing a heavier strength block, right? And we can all agree athletes are not power lifters. And so I used to call it like a modified max effort phase where, hey, we're pushing the weight, but the core movement is intact, right? They're not getting into like the really like rounded back postures or where the speeds are incredibly slow. And you're saying the same thing with these weighted jumps, right? There's definitely that sweet spot where, hey, the force trace is intact, right? The slow stretch shortening cycle is intact, and they're not cheating the motion, or they're not getting into these compensatory movement strategies to try and execute the task. And I think that's so important that we monitor these things, right? Because it's not just about whatever is prescribed. It's, hey, are they doing things in a way that's going to then carry over to sport?
Yeah. And I think just to go back on that a little bit, while I might mention, the force trace there and how it kind of changes when you get to that tipping point of load, that doesn't mean you need to have that tool to do it. Like, it's still,
no, you can see it with your eyes.
Is it smooth? Is it relaxed? Is it like that kind of fast, relaxed force development as opposed to that really tense, over effortful force development? So
yes,
you're dead right. Like, fundamentally, it still comes down to like just making good coaching decisions and making some subjective judgment calls on, do we go this way or do we go that way?
Yep. Okay. One more question, then we'll start to wrap this up. And I almost hate going here, but I think this is really relevant because I'm really shocked. Like, the more I've talked about not just strength training, right? Because I come from, the 2000s and T Nation, and people think a lot about strength training, right? And rightfully so. That's the era that we came up in. But as I've started talking more about plyometrics and sprint training and, athletic development as a whole, there's a lot of people that struggle with, they know how to write and execute a strength training program, right? They know 3x10 and they're comfortable with that. But the second you start talking about jump training or plyometrics, they're like overwhelmed. It's like you're talking a different language and they have no idea how to program volume. And I know this is something you've talked about before, so I think it's relevant here. You have your like different, kind of segments, your developmental phases and your intensification. Could you just help people understand, like, if they want to start introducing low-level plyometrics with their clients or with their young athletes, where do they even start with volume recommendations?
Okay, yeah. Yeah, it's a tricky one because I think when you have that kind of background, like, you mentioned you had, and probably kind of similar, it can be very easy to fall into the trap of using our kind of strength training reps and set schemes for plyometric training. I think I've definitely been guilty of that in the past. And so again, I talked earlier about maybe 3 phases of plyometric training and, kind of about foundation development and, let's say, realization or intensification. But if we kind of take that development phase, because that's where I feel like it begins to look like plyometric training. And it might be, some exercises might be near maximal, although they may not be like super maximal in terms of stepping off boxes and stuff.
Sure.
I would say there, like, depending on whether you're taking a little bit more of an intensification approach or taking a little bit more of a voluminous kind of work capacity approach, I think there, like, your plyometric training, we tend to think about volume as number of foot contacts. So I think it could be anything from 120 to 300 foot contacts a session. Now, it sounds like an awful lot, but think about maybe what, like, I'm just doing the numbers in my head here. If you are doing something that's submaximal and it's kind of repetitive and cyclical, like pogo jumping or like single leg hopping or, lateral bounds, that might be something like, 6 exercises for 15 to 20 reps each for 2 to 3 circuits. Like, it adds up pretty quick.
Yeah.
That's submaximal. So that might take you up to 300 contacts. And that would be typical of, again, what you might see in some of those protocols, like the Altus Rudiment series or some of those, like I talked to, like
Boom, Checkmater stuff. Yeah.
Really influential for me. That's kind of the rough volumes you'd be talking about. But again, there's a couple of things going on there that allow you to accumulate the volume. They are less intense because we're constraining intensive effort and we're constraining the exercises. And there's variation built into them. You know what I mean? So you have 6 or 7 different exercises. So you're not stressing the joints, the ligaments, the tendons in the exact same way all the time. You have variation built into your workouts, which probably helps, manage the risk a little bit. On the lower end of that, let's say if you're up 100 or 120 foot contacts, that might be where you would be if you are using slightly more intense exercises. So maybe that's low to moderate hurdle jumps. Maybe you're going through a series of 8 hurdles, 6 times. All of a sudden now you're up to 50 contacts.
Yeah.
Maybe before you did that, you did some jumps with submaximal pogos in between. Like all of a sudden you're out. So then you only have 2 or 3 exercises. They're slightly more intense, but your volume is maybe more in the 100 to 120 foot contacts. And what I would say is, so we're in this where we are talking about this kind of middle development phase. We've done some base work. We've done some kind of due diligence around foot, ankle, calf conditioning, jump landing mechanics. So now we're doing it's a little bit more training. And so in that example I just gave, there you might have, maybe it's 120 foot contacts, but it might be just 2 or 3 exercises. And again, so we have less variation, a little bit more intensity. So as a result, we're lowering the volume compared to the 300 foot contacts I talked about earlier. And I think what's probably important there also is to understand that as we intensify, we've probably got to bring that volume down a little bit.
For sure.
The last point on that middle section I talk about, a lot of those exercises that we do are cyclical. So, repeat pogos, for example, repeat hurdle jumps. Maybe it's submaximal skipping or bounding drills. They're cyclical in nature. And I think what I find with those is you don't want to have the reps per set be too small, because I think there's a degree of feel and learning that happens within a set. I can't, again, this is a bit speculative and a bit...
Yeah, no, 1,000%.
But there's a degree of learning within the set how to modulate your lower limb stiffness to effectively contact the ground to get better outputs. So let's say you're doing a skipping type drill or maybe a submaximal bounding drill, you might stand back and observe and see that the athlete is only kind of getting it by the 3rd or 4th rep. So you may as well do 8 or 9 reps. You know what I mean?
Right. Absolutely. Yeah.
4, Then I guess the question is, I might be going off topic here, but in that phase, the question is, well, is that work intense enough to actually drive meaningful adaptation?
Yeah.
And I don't know the answer to that question. I don't know if that is, I don't know if it is tendon stiffness or fast twitch, muscle hypertrophy. I don't know. Selective. I don't know. But I think what that phase allows you to do, again, I kind of gave that context of Irish sport and wet training surfaces, cold weather and all that. I think what that allows you to do is, as a coach, it gives you lots of repetition to observe. As an athlete, it gives you lots of repetition to learn.
Yes.
I do think there is an inherent skill in that kind of modulation of lower limb stiffness in response to the ground. So you can learn that, you're learning how to pre-activate before you hit the ground. And then also I think it allows you to probably, if you have the luxury of working with athletes like this, it allows you to probably establish the athlete's kind of tolerable volumes of work. If you jump straight to the intense stuff, the realization stuff, the drop jumps or the repeated high hurdle jumps, if you make a training error, you've kind of got a big problem. You know what I mean? Because it's quite intense. At that lower intensity stuff, you'll probably detect the errors a little bit earlier, and it's probably a little bit safer to fail. So then I think once you get to the real intense stuff, it's just got to be about, it'll tend to be less exercises because now you're really working on trying to drive specific adaptation. You're really trying to move the dial on that reactive strength development with your plyometrics, or maybe that fast dynamic strength development with your loaded jumps. So now I think you probably are a little bit more towards what we think of as strength training volumes. It might be somewhere between 30 and 50 foot contacts a session. So again, think about what that might look like. That might be, 5 sets of 6 to 8 high hurdles, but really short, explosive contraction, ground contact times, long recoveries in between. That block of work might be 40, 50 ground contacts. Might do some warm-up prep before it. Might do some lifting after it, or some sprint work after it. But that's, you're probably using one exercise to try and do a specific adaptation, but now you're down to a quarter of the volume that you might have used previously.
Yeah. No, I love that, man. One of the things that really has stood out to me, just as I've tried to understand plyometrics more, understand jump training better, and now see I'm using both terms interchangeably, especially plyometrics, right? Or differentiating between the two is that idea of impact, right? And there's so many ways you can think about it, but that idea of impact, I think, will really help you if you're listening and you're trying to understand intensity, right? Think about the impact that you're going to feel when you're doing an in-place jump, right? Or like a pogo, very low intensity, very low impact versus, yeah, if you're doing high hurdle jumps and you're trying to explode off the ground, the impact there is entirely different. And so, while it's not as maybe as measurable as it is a weight on a bar, if you start to think in terms of impact, I think that's a good way for you to start to understand how intense is this activity. And therefore, as we all learned very early on, if intensity is going up, volume has to come down.
Yeah.
So,
and there's probably a few other little factors in there in this, we might call like intensity modulators or intensity considerations. And they would be things like, and you can use this to build up an overall profile of what you want to do or how you might manipulate things, but the surface on which you're performing it. So for example, here at our training facility, we have this long gymnastics mat that's like, maybe a couple inches thick. So you get big volumes on that because doesn't give you a lot back. It dampens the impact. So it's great for developing a bit of like tissue tolerance and work capacity, but it's not great for elastic reactive strength development. You can do more volume because it's softer. Or if you have a really hard track surface, you might do less volume because it's harder, greater impact. How much your athlete weighs might be a consideration. If you're a really heavy, big, powerful athlete, putting a lot of impact force on a single limit bound, and you might not do it, or you might massively pare back the volume.
Right.
And I think, also, the appropriateness of the training, might depend on the athlete's injury history as well. And you might be far more conservative with people with maybe patellar tendonitis histories or, plantar fasciitis histories or whatever it might be. They're all the little bits. So like, well, I think you should think about volume in ranges, and you should be thinking about like, what good reason do I have to go to the upper end of this range, or what good reason do I have to go to the lower end of this range?
Yep. I love it. Okay. Big question time. If you could alter the space-time continuum and give young Eamonn Flanagan one piece of advice, what would it be?
I hate these kind of questions. What would I do?
Nobody likes these questions.
I started off at the beginning talking about like probably the opportunity and the luck that I had. Like I got into the industry at the right time, when it was probably a viable career, but it wasn't so saturated. I had big support from my parents and other people around me at the time to try and like make a go of that. So probably I realize that now, but maybe it would have been nice to be more appreciative or more reflective of that at the time. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
And maybe the second bit is probably, I think like most of us, as you get a little bit older, you try and maybe make more decisions based on life and family. And when you're younger, you probably make more decisions based on career and progression. And there's a balance you got to strike there. But
sure,
if I was doing things differently, I'd probably make more of the decisions, even when I was younger, on the kind of life, family balance side of things, I think, because I'm lucky I've had some amazing experiences in sport. I don't think my life would be any less rich if I hadn't had some of those experiences,
Yeah. No, I love that, man. Okay. Last but not least, we got our lightning round. So 4 fairly short questions. Your answer can be as long or short as you like. Okay. Number 1, is it true if I give you a t-shirt, you are loyal to me forever? Because you actually said this on the Sportsmith podcast a while back. So if that's true, I'm sending an iFast basketball shirt to Dublin.
Look, I get the impression that you're a kind of family-friendly show. You know what I mean? So I don't talk about what I would do for free t-shirts. So let's.
I love it. Okay, I'll take that as a yes. Number 2, I feel like when we were building up to the show, or when we were emailing back and forth, you said you have what? Is it a new course, new webinar, new class coming up? What's that all about?
So I guess there's maybe 2 things. So one, I'm going to do a webinar for an Irish company called Kinetic IQ in, I think, 2 weeks. And
okay.
We'll probably talk a lot about the same stuff we've talked about tonight, strength quality classification, what testing can you use, how can you manipulate testing to get some of the outcomes, that you want to get. So a lot of it will be old ground from what we've covered tonight. I think the beauty of the webinar is that you got the slides and you got some visuals. And so it maybe if people are interested in the stuff we've talked about tonight, that might help kind of bring it to life a little bit with kind of visual and working examples.
Yeah,
so yeah, maybe
I love
okay,
it.
I'll send you the link to that and that can go in the show notes or something.
I will absolutely put that in the show notes. And I would just say, if you can attend that, definitely do that. Number 3, why do you describe yourself as a comedy weightlifter? I think that's in your Twitter bio.
It is.
Explain that to me.
And I don't think there's a lot to explain. I was in a former life. I got into it too late. So as much as I probably loved it, I wasn't really that good at this, to a point. And so, I was a weightlifter, but again, I'm sure as many people laughed at me as were impressed by me. So
it is fun though. It is fun though.
The great thing about it, again, it really opened up doors for me because, again, I probably got a couple of pieces of work early on in my career because, there was a perception that maybe I knew my way around the weight room and had some technical insight in the weight room that maybe people who had more of a speed or conditioning bias to their approach didn't have. And that definitely opened some doors for me for sure. And I was lucky enough to do some of my PhD at Northern Michigan University. And at that time, there was a small United States Olympic Education Center there. Small weightlifting team there. And that opened doors to me to train with some real weightlifters, And I also just think that when you learn from doing to a degree. The awesome thing about being like in a weightlifting squad or a group or even just training with friends, like, the biggest influences on me career-wise are probably like 2 or 3 guys that I did weightlifting with for most of my life or most of my adult life. But one of the great things is you learn by doing, sure. But every time you sit down between reps, you're watching other people, as long as you're not on your phone.
Yeah.
You learn from watching everybody else. Like, why did he miss that lift? Why did he make that lift? Should he go up by 2 kilos? Should he go up by 5? Like, you're just like subconsciously, you're just downloading all the time. You're learning about different body shapes without even realizing that you're learning about different body shapes, execute lifts in different ways, or certain injury histories, just because they're your buddy and you're talking to them, can't do certain lifts or have to adapt certain things. So, but I got a hell of a lot more out of weightlifting professionally than weightlifting got for me as an athlete, that's for sure.
I love it, man. I love it. And I could say a lot about powerlifting for me, a lot of the same things. And I like that idea of, you're constantly kind of downloading and processing, right? If you're switched on and you're always thinking about, okay, how's this person move? Why is this person such a good bench presser and such a horrible deadlifter? Like, you're always thinking about that stuff. So I love that. Okay. Last but not least, number 4, what's next for Eamonn Flanagan? What are you working on? What are you excited about? Anything?
Just trying to get through every day. I'm nothing like I work here at our National Institute of Sport, where, we're at the end of the kind of first year post-Olympics. We've got 3 years to the next Olympic and Paralympic Games. It's awesome to see how the Irish kind of sports ecosystem has really evolved since Rio to Tokyo to Paris. Like, I see it as being a real evolving and growing kind of Olympic sport infrastructure. So that's really exciting. So, I'm working a lot in rowing at the moment, hopefully building back into work with rowing a lot as their season kicks off. So for me, it's just about trying to show up every day and get through each day, get through each week. And having, I like to challenge myself that little bit by doing stuff like this or dipping my toe a little bit into coach education stuff. So I usually have 1 or 2 projects like that on each horizon, like the webinar we spoke about or stuff like that.
Yeah, I love it. Well, Eamonn, this has been amazing. I know you are very busy. We're not in the same time zone, obviously. So I appreciate you making time for this and coming on the show. Where can my listeners find out more about you and all the great work you're doing?
I think Twitter, X is probably the only place really. I'm not on Instagram or TikTok or any of those ones yet. But I try to share stuff that you've mentioned.
Yeah.
We're talking about plyometric volumes. I probably have stuff, if you scroll back in my Twitter history, about that kind of thing. I just try and share stuff that I think is interesting that maybe I want to be challenged on if people see a challenge in it. So I tend to post there maybe once a week or so.
Yeah, no, I would just second that. Like, there's so much great stuff. You're one of the few people whose stuff I'm really like immersed in there because there's always things that make me think, and I really respect that. So, Eamonn, again, man, thank you so much for your time, brother. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Mark. My pleasure.